first thing you need to do is go ahead and unbolt the seat. There's just the 2 Allen bolts there to take it off, and then start taking off the panels. Start with the side panels above the air filter there, and then just kind of work your way around the bike. Make sure you are cataloging your bolts, keep them organized. I like a little muffin tin is a great way to separate your bolts, and you can label where each of them came off. Be mindful of the plastic clips on the front of the radiator guard. Those do use an 8mm socket to take off, and then they just kind of pop out. And then you can remove both of the side panels by disconnecting the turn signals. Next, you can remove the gas tank support bracket. You actually don't fully need to take this bracket off. You can keep it bolted to the tank and just unbolt it from the sides. Prop up your gas tank, undo the electrical connector for the fuel pump. There's a breather hose there. And then the fuel line can be a little tricky. You just kind of move that orange clip out of the way and press the little tabs and pull it off. And then you can remove your gas tank. Next, you just work your way around the bike. Start removing cable ties on the right side of the bike. There's a big harness there. All the connectors are different sizes, so it's pretty easy to just disconnect them, and you won't forget which ones go where. We removed the rectifier there and the plugs, and then just kind of started clearing things out. You'll see later why it's important to make sure this area is as tidy and organized as it can be. There's a lot of things that could get in the way, so the more that you're able to take off, the better. Just be mindful of little parts like these washers, spacers, and all the bolts that you don't drop one down somewhere in the engine that you have to fish out later. On the right side of the bike, you can remove the plastic tray by taking the couple bolts out. That tray kind of gets in the way of getting access to the cover, so it's a good idea to remove that tray, as well as the one on the other side of the bike underneath where the ABS pump is. One other thing you could do is use blue masking tape to mark some of these cables or electrical connectors, just so you don't forget to plug something back in. We also disconnected the clutch cable just to get that out of the way. And then you can work your way to the radiator, undo the bolts that hold on the radiator guard, and then that thing just kind of slides off. You can disconnect the connectors for the air map sensor as well as the rectifier, and then continue unplugging the rest of the connectors and the harness on the right hand side of the bike. Again, all these are different sizes, so it'll be easy to figure out which one goes where when you get to reassembly. Next, you'll need to take off the radiator so you can loosen the cap, pull the hose off of the reservoir there, and you can drain it. And then it's a good idea to add some tin foil so you don't make a mess, and you can undo the 8mm bolt to drain at the very bottom here at the water pump, and that's the best way to drain the cooling system. If you open the radiator cap, it's just going to flow better. You'll also need, since we are removing the radiator, you'll need to remove all the hoses anyway, and you can undo the radiator from the bracket. And once it's loose, you'll kind of pull it out of the way, and then you'll need to disconnect the wire that is connecting to the fan. Next, you just want to remove all these connectors out of the way. It's a good idea to tie them up with zip ties or a bungee cord. The cleaner and more organized your space is, the more you've got an area to work with, and you're keeping your space clean and organized. Next, you can pull out the ignition coils. You don't need to remove the spark plugs yet, but you do need to remove the breather hose from the top of the valve cover. And then if you can, use some compressed air to blow off the area the best you can. We also washed the bike before we started just to make sure it's free of dust that might drop into the engine. Next, you'll use an Allen wrench to loosen the bolts for the valve cover. It's always a good idea with the valve cover and the cam ladders to do one bolt at a time and kind of work your way around in a circle or a star pattern, so you're not putting too much stress. Now we're removing the valve cover, which a lot of people seem to think is very difficult, but if you have a nice, clean, organized space, you see how easy it is to pull it out by rotating it as you're facing the bike, rotating it counterclockwise, and then it pulls right out the front. You can then pull your spark plugs out and make things easier when you start turning the cams. And then you can open up the bolts for your timing marks. This is how you're going to turn the motor to get to top dead center, and there's a timing mark which will show you exactly where you're positioned. Now that you've got the valve cover removed, it's time to start taking out the cams and checking the valves. Make sure you've got the proper clearance and a good set of feeler gauges, metric feeler gauges. Start with the left cylinder first, and you're going to turn the crank with a 19mm socket to top dead center. You'll see a timing mark in that little window on the side of the engine cover. You can also eyeball it the best you can, just make sure the cam lobes are not facing down and pushing on the valve bucket. Next, since we're starting with the left side, the way this bike works, you can check the left side altogether, both the exhaust and the intake. Use caution, take your time here, use the proper feeler gauges, check, double check, triple check that you've got the right sizes, and make sure you record the sizes that you're able to put in. Whatever is the closest size feeler gauge that doesn't fit is about what your clearance is, or the one that actually does fit, somewhere in between those two. So make sure you're recording on your sheet what the clearance is, and don't mix up your exhaust and intakes. Make sure you've got that. So you can see what my clearance was. The intake is actually in spec at 0.12, but it's pretty close, so we're going to go ahead and adjust those anyway, then move to the right side. Same thing, move it to top dead center, using the timing marks and making sure the cam lobes are facing outward. There are also indentations on the cams that show you where top dead center is for both intake and exhaust. So check all the clearance, record what you have, and compare it with what the spec is. And you can see that all of my valves are out of spec. One actually was in spec, but it's close enough that we're going to go ahead and adjust it anyway. Next, you'll need to take tension off the cam chain. We actually pulled off the cam tensioner completely. We removed it from the bike, but this particular tensioner you actually don't have to. You can use an Allen wrench to turn counterclockwise to actually back off the tension on the cam tensioner, and then you just reset it when you put it back in. It's not a bad idea to remove it if you're going to replace the gasket. You see how it turns here and resets. So you could do it either way. We pulled it. Some tensioners are hydraulic. This one happens to be mechanical. Next, use 8mm socket to remove the cam ladders. Again, do this in a star pattern, working your way around so you're not putting unnecessary tension on any side of it. Just do a little bit at a time. Once they're all loose, then you can pull them all out and they come out pretty easy. We're starting with the front, which is the exhaust side. Either way you do it is fine, just whatever setting you're on. And also be mindful of marking your cam chain placement. You don't want your timing to get off when you reassemble everything. We also zip tied the cam chain to one of the sprockets there, just so it didn't fall into the engine case. Next, it's a good idea to use a magnet to pull off the bucket. Make sure you've got your torque wrench handy. You will need that for a couple things. It's also a good idea to stuff some paper towels into the engine compartment there so you don't accidentally drop a shim or a tool inside. And once you remove the bucket, then we're going to remove each shim individually and start the adjustment. Make sure you've got your shims handy. When you pull each shim out, they typically do have a marking on them of what size it is. Sometimes those get worn off, sometimes you can't read it. So it's always a really good idea to have a caliper there to be able to accurately measure what side it is. So for example here, this particular valve clearance was at 0.20 with a 1.78 shim. So we replaced it with a 1.70 shim to make the clearance 28. And here, pretty similar sizing. It was out of spec at 0.17, so by using a slightly smaller shim, it brings the clearance to 0.29, which is within spec. And you're just going to repeat that for every single one of the shims. Double check your math, double check the clearance. You don't want to have to redo this once you get the whole bike put back together. So it's important to take your time and pay attention to what you're doing. Next, you can put a little lube on the buckets there and the cams and install those. It's a little bit easier to work it into the cam chain first, so you're not fighting the tension, and then you can place it where it goes. Since you used paint to mark the position, you should be able to see exactly where it should go, and you're going to verify this later. Put a little bit of oil on the cam ladder before you put it on. Be mindful of those little metal dials. Those tend to fall out and get lost in your engine, so be real careful with those. Once you get that in place, you can go ahead and insert the bolts and get them finger tight. You're not going to fully tighten those yet. You just want to get those bolts in there and make sure that nothing comes loose or falls out while you're working on the intake side. Start by removing the bolts of the cam ladder on the intake side, and you can pull the ladder out and then carefully remove the cam. There you can see the buckets. We like to secure the chain, again, just to make sure it doesn't fall off or drop in or get your timing all messed up. And here you can see a bunch of numbers that shows basically what the specs were. We repeated the same thing. This is the most time consuming part, is just making sure you get your math right and get the proper shims in. Once you do that, you're able to get the cams installed and put the ladder back on. Again, same thing, get the bolts in there, make sure you have your timing lined up with your cam sprockets and the chain to where it was before you removed them, and you'll double check this again once you start rotating. Next, you can start tightening down the cam ladder bolts. Again, do this in a star pattern. 10 Newton meters is the torque spec on these, so do one at a time, kind of moving your way around so you don't put too much tension on any one area. And you could do this both for the intake and the exhaust side cam ladders. Next, you'll reinstall your cam chain tensioner, or if you left it in, you could turn that Allen wrench clockwise and it will actually release the tension and put it back on the cam chain, so don't forget to do that. Next, you can turn the engine and make sure that everything lines up as it should. Check your indicators on the camshaft there. After you give it a few rotations, make sure everything looks like it should. Then you want to check your valve clearance again. Get it back to top dead center, check the left side cylinder 1, then rotate and check the right side cylinder 2. Make sure everything's lined up, double check your specs so that they are exactly what you expected them to be. This is your opportunity to make sure that you've done things right before you put everything back together. Make sure you clean and replace any other gaskets, and there's also in the kit a copper washer for the inspection window. Next thing you'll do is replace the spark plugs. This can be a little tricky when you don't have a lot of space to work from. I like to just drop the spark plug in there, then drop the socket in, and then add ratchet attachments just to get the right size and spacing that I need. It's also not a bad idea to put a little anti-seize on the threads of the spark plug to make sure that they don't get stuck there for next time. Next, on the valve cover, you can remove the bolt grommets, being careful not to scratch anything, and remove the valve cover gasket. It's not a bad idea to clean this cover, especially the groove where the gasket goes. Just make sure that that is free of any debris so that you don't introduce any inadvertent oil leaks. You can start by placing the gasket, make sure it's the right size fit, and you can trim off that extra little piece that doesn't serve any function. It's just to keep the shape of the gasket for shipping, so you could cut that off. A good method is to apply a little bit of silicone to the valve cover gasket and even to the top of the engine. This will help your gasket stay in place when you're installing it. The best way to do this is to place the gasket there first, making sure it's as even and lined up as possible, because when you get the cover on, you're not going to be able to see the part of the gasket where the spark plugs are. So this way you're getting everything as lined up as you can. This method makes it a little bit easier now to just slide the cover in, not having to worry about the gasket falling off, and you can easily slide the cover in, drop it into place, and it should fit perfectly. Make sure once you get it aligned that you double check. We're looking here with a mirror, and you can also put your fingers in the hole there to make sure that those spark plug gaskets are in place and they're not being pinched or bound up by anything. Once that's nice and snug, you can install the bolts for the valve cover. Same thing here, do one at a time, a little bit at a time. Then you can go ahead and insert your ignition coils and your crankcase breather. And the rest is just reassembling. Work the same way that you did, work backwards by installing the radiator, making sure that you've got all those bolts. Take your time here, you don't want to forget to plug anything in. Get all the connectors. Sometimes you may have a loose wire or some kind of a breather hose that you may have pulled off that got stuck somewhere. Again, if you want to mark these with a piece of blue masking tape, that's a great way to keep track of everything that you've unplugged so you don't forget to get something back in. And even though this looks like a mess, it's pretty simple. Every one of those connectors is a different shape and size, so you can't accidentally get it. Just make sure you've got the brackets clipped in where they should be. One goes on top and one goes on bottom there. Same thing for the ABS pump. You can just get that bracket in place. Don't forget the little aluminum spacer collars and get the bolts in position. I always like to finger tighten everything first to make sure that things are placed how they should before I actually bolt anything down. And now back on the right side of the bike, the wiring harness, we're getting everything into place there, bolting that bracket back in, making sure none of the cables are pinched or binded up. This is where it's helpful to keep everything nice and clean and tidy so when you go back to doing it, you're all good. Now for the coolant flush, make sure you have a good quality coolant. 50-50 mix, we have mixed it ourselves with distilled water. Make sure you've got all your bolts plugged, you've got your water pump bolt tightened so that you don't start leaking right when you pour it in. And fill up the radiator as much as you can. Burp it a little bit with the radiator hose to get any of the air bubbles out, and make sure you've got the radiator fully topped off. You can install the gas tank now, but we're using an auxiliary fuel tank and basically doing the same thing, just running it with gasoline to start the bike. And because coolant is not everywhere in the system yet, what you need to do is run the bike for a while, and coolant doesn't actually start circulating in your engine until the fan kicks on and the thermostat opens. So this might take 10 or 15 minutes. That's why we have fans on it to keep the bike cool. And once the fan kicks in, you can let the bike cool down. Don't open the radiator cover when it's hot. Once it cools down, have the bike turned off, open the cap, top it off, bleed it again, and fill up your reservoir. You can repeat this process 1 or 2 times just to make sure it's full. And lastly, you'll synchronize the throttle bodies. This is something that your dealership can do if you don't have the tools to do it. It's helpful to just make sure you've got a good, consistent idle between both cylinders.
All right, guys, that's pretty much it. Make sure you double check all your work. You don't want to have to go back in and take the valve cover off and check your valve clearance again. So take your time as you're doing it. Don't forget to top off your coolant and get out there and ride.